Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn session, looking at our draft street tree species list, our criteria and typical conditions. I'm really happy to be with you this afternoon and have a chance to share some information. If you had a chance to attend last month's General CFAC meeting, I do want to say a huge thank you to Shelley Billick for her facilitation of that meeting as the chair, and to CFAC members as well as the attendees that really provided such a robust conversation that day with Bob Perry and myself. It was really wonderful to have Bob share his work supporting the city in the development of this draft list, as well as be able to have really robust discussion and questions around the list and the criteria that we've been working on. So thank you to CFAC folks. And I'll provide another update right before we get started. Not just that meeting, we also have a public comment form that is available for you to go and respond and tell us what you think about the criteria, about the trees on the list, on the trees that aren't on the list. And I'm really happy to share that we're just shy of 300 comments in that form. And that may not seem like a huge number, but I am very encouraged by the level of participation that we've had on that comment form, and encourage you to share that with others. That is open until, we're planning to keep it open until the end of September 15th. So about another week to provide public comment through our comment form on the street tree list. I'll make sure to put that in the chat, the link in the chat before we end. So today we're going to talk about trees. And I'll refer again to our pillars of urban forest management. We're talking about tree plantings, the selection of tree species for the public right-of-way. And we know that the decisions we make on the species that we plant have a real significant impact on maintenance. There tends to be a great number of feelings in the community, a need for engagement around the tree species selected, because people really care about what is in their public space around their homes, either positively or negatively. So we're going to go ahead and think about our basic considerations when we're thinking about street trees for the public right-of-way. That is the area between the curb and the sidewalk, that parkway space. We want to have healthy, long-lived trees. If we're going to put a tree in that location, we want to make sure that it is giving us a significant amount of benefits to the community, and that we're minimizing the risk to people and private property. So we know that, again, in a forest, a tree can fall over and maybe it blocks a trail, or maybe it hits on something, but it's less likely to hit people or private property than it is in our urban forest, where we have cars and pedestrians. So we definitely are looking to minimize the risk to those targets so that we can have the amenity of shade and the other benefits trees provide with the minimal risk. And then we also have to consider site conditions and other infrastructure, and consider what tree species will thrive in the available conditions. And I'll flag that part of the really robust conversation at CFAC talked about thinking beyond our current conditions. But while we really are looking in that direction, and the work that I've been doing with City Plants and others, and USC looking at our tree equity work, we're talking a lot about improving site conditions. But in the meantime, we do have to deal with the reality in our current parkway space. And I'm just going to flag one more time, this healthy, long-lived component. If we're going to invest resources, city funds, into planting and maintaining trees over the course of their lives, we want to make sure that that initial investment really pays off, that we have plants that can do really well over a long period of time and be healthy, not just surviving in the space, but really thriving in our communities and providing significant benefits. So as part of the draft tree list, this says master tree list, but this is our criteria summary sheet from that draft tree list. One of the characteristics and criteria that we're looking at is, are the trees site suitable? That is, can they thrive in street tree settings with restricted soil volumes, other infrastructure, reduced amount of water, and infrequent pruning? And within that, we're looking at trees that don't have weak branch attachments, weak limbs, or high root damage potential. We all know that many communities have issue with trees when they've lifted the sidewalk and caused damage to that infrastructure. So we definitely are looking to avoid that. The next kind of category of criteria is climate compatibility. Are these trees that are going to do well in our geographic area with increasing drought, high temperatures, and wind. Are the trees going to do well in the Los Angeles climate that we have currently and projected climate for the future? Are they ecosystem enhancing? Do they protect, conserve, and restore native biodiversity? We want to avoid plants that are considered invasive and want to avoid plants that are highly susceptible to pest and disease, as well as looking at those benefits to the humans in this area, significant shade, cooling, and carbon sequestration. And as a general rule of thumb, we're looking at ones that are going to be attractive year-round, ones that we can get and are commercially available at nurseries that we'll be able to purchase in the size that we use for the public right-of-way, are not highly allergenic, and do not have highly poisonous, readily consumable plant parts or thorns. That's another one that we're adding to the criteria here. And in my review with Urban Forestry Division, they reminded me that we like to avoid plants that have thorns in the public right-of-way, just for safety. So I'm just going to walk us through a couple of the different types of site conditions, just to kind of ground us in where we're typically planting, the types of conditions that we're typically planting in. Maybe you've already filled out the comment form. Maybe you're looking to fill out the comment form, but I did want to provide just a little bit of context. And you obviously know what your neighborhood looks like, what kinds of street trees you have there, which ones you really enjoy and like, which ones you would have picked different species. But this is just kind of thinking more broadly across our city. So here we have a very small parkway. So, and we find that in a lot of the areas that have low tree canopy cover, we frequently have conditions like this, where the parkway is either non-existent or very small. I would say that this is about a 3-foot wide parkway. And that really limits what we can put in place. You can see in the background, we've got a ficus tree that was planted by someone at some point. Whether or not that was planted by city forces, I think pretty clear. It probably wasn't city staff that planted it, but we have, again, a tree that's going to be very large and lifting the sidewalk over time. And the tree that we put in its place is going to be a smaller tree, which is fine, but we're looking to provide additional canopy benefits. And the larger the location that you can plant in, the more significant the benefits from a larger tree that you can receive. Here's another fairly constrained condition that I just will flag. And if you spend any time in downtown LA and other commercial corridors, you probably have seen what we refer to as tree wells. So we have here a cut that's probably 4 by 4 feet with a tree growing in the middle of it, where, again, you don't have a lot of access to soil volume and other components that will help the tree grow really healthy over the course of its life. There are other trees in the area that are doing well, but this is not ideal site conditions. And we do, once again, have to think very carefully about trees that are not going to pose a risk to pedestrians, to the cars adjacent, and lift the sidewalk in such a small space. Here I've added this image. This is a slightly wider parkway, but you'll notice we've got overhead power lines. So even though we have the available soil volume to allow us to plant potentially a larger tree, we can't plant a larger tree because there's overhead power lines that restrict the height of the plant that we would want to put in this space. So it's not only the width of the space here and the available soil to the tree to grow its healthy roots and be able to get nutrients, oxygen, and water. It's also looking above to see if there's space for the crown of the tree over time. And we'd rather plant trees that are not going to conflict with those overhead lines. This is a similar parkway space where trees were planted, but no overhead power lines. So there was a little bit more options in this location for tree planting because you did not have that restriction. I really like this image because you've got all the infrastructure, not all, but many of the infrastructure complex in one place. You have a driveway, you have an intersection, you've got traffic signals, you see these utility boxes. We typically want to plant further away from the utility boxes. And again, the street light, which all of these, we have our spacing guidelines that indicate how far we should plant. This palm was was likely not permitted for the location. But again, these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about when we put a tree in place. Are we a sufficient distance from the street light so that we're not interfering with the light that it provides in the evening? The tree shades during the day, but it also can shade at night and keep the sidewalk from being illuminated by the street lights. Are we able to see the traffic signal or stop sign? And are we staying a significant distance from the utility boxes and other underground infrastructure that could eventually conflict with the tree? I like to add this, and this is an area where we have an undeveloped public right-of-way space. There is no sidewalk in this component, and I know that this is a characteristic we sometimes see, particularly in the valley, that poses its own separate challenges. You do have additional space for trees, but it's a little bit less clear because we have an undeveloped public right-of-way. And we've talked quite a bit about median islands, and I'll just flag that by and large, the list that we developed was intended just for the public right-of-way, the parkway spaces. We weren't looking at a list specific to medians, and I know that there's been a lot of conversations with CFAC members and city staff about the potential that landscape median islands could pose for our urban forest and for biodiversity goals. I will share that that has been an area where we haven't had a lot of funding for the upkeep of the median islands historically. It's been an area where Urban Forestry Division also manages the landscape median islands in addition to street trees in the public right-of-way. And it's an area where we could probably use some additional resources. And I think we'll have a lot of interesting conversations moving forward about what we want to see, how we can utilize these spaces with Urban Forestry Division and other departments across the city. So a couple of next steps, and then I'll go to questions. I see that I already have one in the queue, but if you have a question related to today's talk, please feel free to type it in that Q&A box. So this fall, we've got the draft species list that we're now receiving public comment on. When we close that public comment period next week on the 15th, I then will be reviewing the feedback that we received and compiling that and developing a version to share publicly, likely with the Board of Public Works and others, as a summation of what we heard from the public and how we plan to address the comments that were made by the public. Additionally, we're working on what I'm referring to as a planting forecast. So we do have our planting season. We're typically looking October to May as the planting season. I say that kind of loosely. When I first started doing tree planting, we said September was kind of the start of the planting season. I think it's better to start in October. September can be pretty hot at times, and we want to wait until it's cooled down a little bit. But for this planting season, we do have a sense of some of the large projects that we're doing, just like we do every year. We have a couple of large projects that are going on. This year, we're trying to gather the data on those projects to put it into a planting forecast with some draft species lists and some maps to be able to share with the public at the front end of the planting season before plants are purchased and projects have started. So we can have a little bit more dialogue and communication with the public, as we know that people are really interested in our planting projects. It won't capture all the trees that are going to be planted next year, but it will include the major projects we're aware of. And then moving forward, the draft species list, I'm hoping, will be more flexible than it has been in the past. And we'll also be working with Urban Forestry Division. They've indicated strongly that if a species that you want to have planted in the public right-of-way in your neighborhood is not on the list, that they will work with communities to talk through the options and whether or not a plant is suitable. And we'll be working on a protocol for that. So it's a very clear process. You know, your neighborhood has historically had one kind of tree that's no longer on the list. How are we going to address that and have those conversations? I know that they're still very interested in doing that, even while we reset the list to be potentially more current, because it hasn't been updated in quite some time. So that being said, we're going to continue looking at improving site conditions, because we know that trees that are going to provide us more benefits are going to come from site conditions that are more optimal for trees, whether that be larger spaces so that we can plant larger species of trees, or just have improved conditions for any size of tree by having additional soil volume available to the tree. We'll be working on nursery availability. Most of the trees on the list are currently available at nurseries, but we want to make sure that ongoing availability of the plants that we want to be planting, that continues and is enhanced. We also are going to be looking at habitat access and connectivity of habitat across Los Angeles, and working with the biodiversity team and others to look at and better understand how we can be strategically placing resources in our urban forest to support wildlife in a very thoughtful way. We need some additional data points and considerations there to make sure that we're clear on what some of those targets might be, but that is in our kind of next steps. And then the last one I'll add here is we hear loud and clear. Both Urban Forestry Division has been showing up to meetings and talking about the need for a minimum of 5 years of establishment care for young trees. We know that that's what community members are also indicating is a desire. Some of our stakeholders have been giving us that feedback that they really want to be sure that we have appropriate resources for establishment care, which we're totally in agreement on. So we'll be looking at resources for young tree care. And then I'm adding to that, I want us to be thinking about that early pruning, the structural pruning that happens on young trees, where you can make cuts on a tree that are going to add to its health and form over time and avoid future issues through some very strategic and thoughtful planned structural pruning, which I will be doing a future Lunch and Learn session on. But that's another area where we're looking for resources so that we go through the process of using the science to select a plant that's going to do well in Los Angeles in the conditions in the public right of way. Let's make sure that we have investment for the establishment care and for this young tree pruning that will help set it up for a long and healthy life in Los Angeles. And I'll add as one final caveat, I know that I just want to be very clear. The draft list that was put forward that we're asking for comment on is, again, only for the public right of way. We're not indicating what we should or should not be planting in parks or on private property. This isn't intended to be a recommended planting list or a preferred plant species list for the city of Los Angeles. This is going to be our list for looking at specifically that public right of way space where we have so many other infrastructure components that are competing with the trees for that space, making sure that we're thoughtful, nuanced, and based in available science for those decisions. With that, I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat the 2 links. One is to the tree list and one is to the comment form. So I'll go ahead and put that here and then we'll answer some questions. So the first question is, where do we send longer comment letters? Is it to my email and with what subject? If I have received some longer discussions on the tree list aside from the comment form allows us to kind of see as a whole and compare comment to comment. But if you do have a longer comment letter, do please feel free to send that to me. And I've been gathering those and we'll include them in our discussion and review of the public comments. So yes, please send those to me. I will be the holder of the documents, so to speak, and then we'll be doing a review internally for that. Let's see, next question. Someone joined late and wants to make sure that there's going to be a recording. There is. We are recording this session and it should be posted by early next week at the latest, if not in the next few days. And here's the next one. Maintenance is a huge part of street trees, but I don't think it should be a driving force to limit selecting the tree species when deciding the varieties. Just because it may need to be trimmed more often doesn't mean it should not be selected. It appears there are only a handful of species that are being planted and not diverse enough. So this is more of a comment, but I definitely agree. We didn't limit based on pruning needs, although we do want to be realistic about the asset that we're managing. I'm hoping that over time we continue to increase the resources available for street tree trimming, but that hasn't happened yet. And so we do want to be thoughtful and judicious when we're putting forward our tree selection. It isn't the only factor, it's one of many. And that's actually what's really interesting is when we think about tree species selection, it actually is very complex. So some folks have seen the master spreadsheet that has, climate zone, water use, all of those kinds of pieces. But the other component is always the community, right? So what is the specific context there? Are there specific benefits that the residents of that neighborhood are concerned about? So Again, if I'm talking with a community that has had a lot of issues with sidewalk uplift, I might tend toward a tree that has, instead of maybe moderate root damage potential, one that has only low root damage potential. And so that I can say with confidence that we're really being super cautious on that side. Either way, so, and I 100% agree that we should be planting a diverse amount of species. And again, part of that is going to be continuing to have this nursery conversation, because the species may be available. Are they always available when we want them? Maybe, maybe not. So that's going to be part of our ongoing work moving forward. And then also, I'm hoping that this planting forecast is going to also support us in looking at our diversity, because we won't be having different projects in different corners of the city managed by different groups, not having that unified look. So we'll be able to take the forecast for this planting season and see across projects, what trees are we planting? Is there a diversity of species across the project and across the city as a whole, or are we really leaning too heavily on a certain number of species? And I'll just share that one of the things I'm excited about with our new tree inventory data is we're also going to be able to have a chance to look at existing stocking rates of certain species in neighborhoods. And this is something that you can access right now. If your neighborhood has been inventoried, you can see the species within your neighborhood council and start to see the number of the different kinds of species, how many of each species is there, et cetera. And that's some of the data that we're looking at as part of the planting forecast, is saying what exists in the community currently, what are we planning to plant? How does that play into the diversity of the species right now? How does it line up against some of the industry guidance for urban forestry? Within urban forestry, we're thinking about some diversity to make sure that we're pest and disease resilient. And so that talks about a certain percentage, not exceeding a certain percentage of a certain genus, species, or family. And so those are other considerations that go into kind of the pot of decision-making for tree species selection. All right, looking at the next question. I don't think we're able to, we're running a very small show right now, so I don't have the ability to unmute specific participants at this point. So if you want to type your question in, I'd be happy to answer it. Have you researched why trees like ficus are not lifting the sidewalk on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, Beverly Hills, and Burbank? That is an interesting question. There are, ficus are really unique species, and I actually would like to bring on a couple staff to talk about ficus particularly. They're, the shade under a ficus, I know that those of you who have spent time under them, is just tremendous. It's so nice and cool when you have a nice big ficus across the street, but we do have instances where they are causing significant uplift to the street and or the sidewalk. So that's a wonderful question, Joanne. I'm not going to go specifically into that at this point. There are techniques like crown reduction and other things I know people have used to limit some of that. And I know that there's also options to do regular root pruning, which is a little controversial, but is another tool in the toolbox for ficus trees. Next question is, why doesn't a city like Los Angeles dictate what the nursery grows? We're extremely limited in the availability in our tree guarantee plantings that used up a lot of tree wells in our neighborhood. And why was not existing functioning sprinkler systems in the parkways taken into consideration when selecting trees? We do typically consider if there is existing irrigation, but the irrigation needed for a lawn is different than what is needed for a tree. Grass roots go down a couple inches, tree roots go down about 18 to 24 inches. And so the needs of grass roots are different than tree roots. It doesn't mean that it doesn't help the tree to have the sprinkler in place or that the tree isn't impacted if you remove the sprinkler system. But it can't be the only driving factor for tree watering, in my opinion. And back to the nursery question, this is really interesting. So when I was working for one of the nonprofits, I essentially asked the same question. I had the opportunity to talk with one of the major nurseries in California, someone fairly high up in the organization. And I said, we're here in LA, we've got the DWP Energy Efficiency Trees program. Why aren't these projects more of a driving factor of what you're growing? And they indicated that the nonprofits, and at the time the city was not planting many trees. It was in a period of time where there had been the significant budget cuts to urban forestry division. So there was very little planting happening outside of the nonprofit partners. And that staff member shared with me that the planting that we're doing at the time represented less than 1% of their total sales annually. And so we weren't as big of a driver as we felt we should be based on the volume of work we were doing. I'm hopeful that as we move forward with the tree species list that's been updated, that this can be a tool for talking with nurseries about what kinds of species we want to see, some of the standards that we want to see in the nursery quality, and continue that dialogue with them among the many things that we're looking at for better management of our urban forest. And I would fully anticipate that as we get into the development of our urban forest management plan, that we'll be having a conversation about this relationship with the nursery industry and the kinds of standards and the species that we want to see. Great question. So we've got a question about a very specific tree, which I will take a look at when we are offline, because this is not really relevant to the tree species conversation today. So I do want to stay focused on that, but I do see the comment from Marcus. I'll go ahead and follow up with you after today's session. I'm going to look and see if we have any other questions. Oh, we do have some in the chat. Try and be nimble here. There's a question around, let's see. Some of them are duplicates, so hold on a second. Will it ever be possible to get the utilities to be submissive to the needs of trees so they work around the trees instead, or the other way around? So I know that and I'm gonna attempt to answer this one at least briefly, because it is I think relevant to, again, our species selection. I think that, and this is actually, I'd like us for a second, just let's think about the Los Angeles that we want. And I know that that's actually why so many of you are showing up to today's session or came to the CFAC session. You have a vision of the kind of Los Angeles that you want to live in, what kinds of trees that you want to see, how those trees are maintained. And I'm really grateful for your participation in the process. It's really encouraging to me. And utilities is another area where we have some conflict with trees that hopefully we'll be able to look at kind of some decision-making tools in the future to think about infrastructure investments where maybe we're able to look at different options for where we put trees so that they're not in conflict with utilities, or how we make sure that we get both of those benefits in the public right of way, the infrastructure that we need for our utilities and our trees. There's a question about city plants and a list of trees for their yard tree program, whether or not they're going to update theirs. This is obviously independent from their workflow, but I know that they've been watching it closely and have been also eager to hear public comment. Although we're talking about two very different contexts, your front yard or backyard has a very different configuration to public space and amount of space available than it does in the parkway. So I know that they are watching and considering. They do have limitations of the types of trees that they plant due to the energy efficiency nature of their funding. So they do have to be thinking about shading in particular, but I know that they are watching this process and having conversations around it. There is a question about the number of comments received. I shared at the beginning, I'll share again now, that we've received just shy of 300 comments. We're at 296. Maybe by the end of today, we'll hit 300. There's another question: for areas that seem largely inaccessible for full tree planting, are there additional considerations for shrubs that can work as small trees, such as toyon? This is something else I've been asking some of the folks that have been asking questions, particularly around our native shrubs like toyon and elderberry, that people are very interested in, obviously, as we were able to add them to our protected tree plant palette. I really would be interested if there are locations you have in mind that you think would be suitable for that species, where you're not going to have obstruction of view for cars trying to make a turn, or for other issues of being able to see. That's part of the reason we have the trees limbed up, is so that they're clear of pedestrian and car paths of travel. But if there are specific scenarios where you think that a species that you really love that's not currently on the list could work or would be advantageous for the city to consider, please consider sharing that. That's something I continue to ask, because some of the species that folks have been asking us to add to the list, I don't see a consistent place where we can apply those species. And that's really important. We don't want to put something on the list that's going to be in very limited contexts. If there are those, again, Urban Forestry Division has said that they will work with applicants to look at other species. And we are just about out of time. I'm going to see, we have quite a few other questions. And I think that most of these are project specific. We do have a couple other biodiversity questions, and we'll look and see. We typically post a blog after the Lunch and Learn session that kind of gives a summary of what was covered and any links that we discussed during the session. I'll take a look at some of these questions and see if we can answer any remaining ones in that blog post that's on the Office of Forest Management website after this event. Thank you all so much for your participation, for the really excellent questions that you raised, and I'm sure we'll have more conversation to come. And we'll be back again in 2 weeks on the 4th Wednesday of the month.